She thought she had everything, until one whispered name in the dark destroyed it all. The man she loved, the sister she trusted, the life she built, all of it, gone in a single breath. This is the story of a woman who walked away from love, only to discover the real betrayal had been carefully engineered by someone far more dangerous than she ever imagined. Drop your city in the comments right now and hit that like button. Let's see how far this story travels. Stay until the very end. You won't see the last twist coming. The storm had been threatening Manhattan all evening. Evelyn Hartwell stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of the penthouse and watched the clouds collapse against each other over the Hudson, thick and purple-black, the kind of weather that made the city feel smaller than it was. Below her, 42 floors down, the streets were already slick. Yellow cabs pushed through standing water. Pedestrians bent their bodies against the wind. The whole island looked like it was bracing for something. She pressed her fingertips against the cold glass and felt the vibration of distant thunder move through her palm. Behind her, the bedroom was quiet. Damien had fallen asleep an hour ago, one arm thrown over his face, his breathing slow and even in the way it always was when he wasn't carrying the weight of whatever board meeting or acquisition or legal fire had consumed his week. In sleep, he looked younger, less guarded. She'd always loved that about him, the fact that sleep stripped away the armor and left behind someone who looked almost breakable. She turned from the window. The bedroom was all dark wood and low light, the kind of room that had been designed by someone paid a great deal of money to make wealth look effortless. She'd never entirely gotten used to it. 3 years with Damien, and she still sometimes stood in the middle of his spaces and felt like a woman visiting a museum after closing time, surrounded by beautiful things that didn't quite belong to her. She was a conservator. She spent her days with dead things, old paper, cracked leather, ink that had faded to ghost traces on vellum. She understood the language of things that had been forgotten. She did not always understand the language of this world. She crossed the room quietly, slipped back under the covers, and lay on her side watching the rain begin to streak down the windows in long silver lines. Damien shifted. She thought he was waking up, and she turned toward him, ready to ask if he wanted water, if the storm had pulled him out of sleep the way it sometimes did. But his eyes stayed closed. His breathing changed. Not the steady rhythm of deep sleep, but something shallower, more restless, his brow pulling together like he was working through something even in unconsciousness. She watched him. His lips moved. She leaned slightly closer without thinking about it, the way you lean toward something you're not sure you heard correctly. He said a name. One word. Barely a sound, more breath than voice. Scarlett. Evelyn went completely still. The rain hit the windows. The thunder rolled somewhere over New Jersey. The city kept moving 42 floors below them, indifferent and enormous. She didn't move for a long time. She told herself she had misheard him. She told herself it was nothing, a fragment of some dream that meant nothing. The way dreams pulled up random faces and random names and stitched them into something that felt meaningful but wasn't. She told herself all of this lying flat on her back in the dark, her hands folded over her sternum, her eyes fixed on the ceiling, her heart beating at a frequency she didn't have a name for. Scarlett, her sister's name in her lover's mouth. She didn't sleep again that night. She lay there until the storm passed and the sky outside the windows shifted from black to the particular gray that comes before dawn, and she thought about the way Scarlett had looked the last time they'd all been in the same room together. A dinner at their father's house in Connecticut, 18 months ago. Scarlett in a red dress. Scarlett laughing at something Damien said, her head tilted back, her hand brushing his arm in the easy way she touched people she was comfortable with. Evelyn had registered it at the time and registered it as nothing. Scarlett touched everyone like that. She always had. It was part of who she was, tactile and warm and physically present in a way Evelyn had never been. She had not let herself think about it twice. She was thinking about it now. She got up at 5:15 before the light was fully in the sky. She moved through the penthouse in the dark, pulling clothes from the closet she kept in the second bedroom. She'd kept some things there from the beginning, a habit she'd never fully examined. And she packed a bag with the quiet efficiency of someone who had been thinking about leaving for longer than she'd admitted to herself. She didn't leave a note. She told herself she would call him. She told herself she would explain. She told herself this was temporary. She just needed space, needed air, needed to think somewhere that wasn't inside the walls of his life. She picked up her bag and walked to the elevator. She did not look back at the bedroom door. The elevator descended 42 floors in silence. She walked out of the building into the wet aftermath of the storm, the air smelling of rain and exhaust, and the particular cold that comes after weather breaks. And she stood on the sidewalk for a moment with her bag at her feet and her coat not quite buttoned. Then she kept walking. Tim, 3 years. That was how long it took for a person to build something new out of the wreckage of something old. 3 years, and a studio in a converted boathouse on the coast of Maine, and work that kept her hands busy and her mind occupied in the specific way that meticulous, patient work could. The kind of work that asked everything of your attention and left no room for the other thing, the thing you were trying not to think about. The boathouse sat at the end of a gravel road that wound through scrub pine and seagrass before it opened onto a small cove. The town nearby, Pemaquid, population under 1,000, had a general store, a post office, a diner that was only open for breakfast and lunch, and enough people who minded their own business that Evelyn had been able to disappear into it without much friction. People knew she restored old books and documents. They knew she was from somewhere south, and that she didn't talk much about it. That was sufficient. That was, in fact, exactly sufficient. She'd built the studio from almost nothing, a folding table and a daylight lamp and the tools she'd brought in the bag she'd packed that morning in Manhattan. Over time, the space had filled. Proper conservation tables, a climate-controlled cabinet for her chemical supplies, a long shelf that held the ongoing projects, each one in its own acid-free enclosure with a label written in her handwriting. She worked mostly for private collectors and small institutions, occasionally for universities. The money was modest but reliable, and she needed almost nothing, which meant it was enough. She had a cat named Parchment, which was either the most or least original name for a conservator's cat, depending on your perspective. She had a truck that was 17 years old and required a particular sequence of ignition steps she'd memorized the way you memorize a combination. She had a routine and a view of the water, and on most days, something very close to peace. She did not have anyone she called after dark. She had come close once. A man named Joel, who ran the boatyard 2 miles up the coast. Quiet, solid, capable of long silences that weren't uncomfortable. They'd had dinner 4 or 5 times over the course of a winter. On the 5th night, he'd reached across the table and covered her hand with his, and she'd felt nothing except a sudden sharp awareness of how much she was performing. She'd ended it that same evening, as kindly as she could, and he'd been decent about it, and they'd remained on nodding terms, and that had been the end of that. She understood that she was still carrying something. She didn't talk about it. She was very good at not talking about it. She was working on a mid-19th century ship's log when the bell above her studio door rang. October. Early afternoon. The light off the water was flat and silver, and the smell of low tide was coming through the gap she kept at the bottom of the window for airflow. She was 3 hours into a delicate section. The ink on one page had been damaged by moisture at some point in the past century, and the paper was pulling away from itself in fibers thin as thread. She was working under magnification with a brush the diameter of a single hair, coaxing the fibers back, applying consolidant in drops almost too small to see. She did not look up immediately. "I'll be with you in a minute," she said, not moving her eyes from the work. Silence from the doorway. The kind of silence that had a shape to it. She set down her brush very carefully. She straightened up. She turned around. Damian Sterling stood in the doorway of her studio with his coat dark from the sea mist and his face carrying 3 years of something she didn't have an immediate word for. He was thinner than she remembered. The line of his jaw was sharper. He was 41 now, and it showed in the right ways and the wrong ones. Steadier in the eyes, harder around the mouth. He did not say her name. He just stood there, as if he'd used up everything he had simply getting through the door. Evelyn didn't move. He became aware in a distant and clinical way that her heart was doing something irregular. She breathed through it. She was very good at breathing through things. "How did you find me?" she said. It wasn't a question. It came out flat, a fact being stated rather than asked. "It took a while," he said. "That's not an answer. I know." He stepped inside without being invited, which was either arrogance or desperation, and she honestly couldn't tell which. He looked around the studio the way people looked at spaces that told them something about a person they hadn't expected. His eyes moved over the shelves, the equipment, the cat asleep on the windowsill. You built something. Don't do that. Do what? Make it a compliment. Make it warm. Don't. She crossed her arms and stayed behind her work table, keeping the distance deliberate. You have about 30 seconds to tell me why you're here before I ask you to leave. He looked at her for a moment without speaking. Something moved across his face. Not quite pain, not quite relief. Something more complicated than either. Scarlett is missing, he said. The room shifted. She heard the words. She processed them. She felt them land in the specific way that words land when they rearrange the furniture of your understanding of things. What? She's been missing for 11 days. I've been to the police. The FBI has opened a preliminary inquiry. Her apartment in Brooklyn was cleared out, not by her, and her phone has been dead since October 3rd. He reached into his coat and pulled out a folded envelope. He set it on her work table. She left this, addressed to you. It was in a sealed envelope inside a larger envelope addressed to me, with a note that said to find you. Evelyn stared at the envelope. She did not touch it. Why would she address something to me through you? Evelyn said slowly. I don't know. I don't know what's in it. I haven't opened it. He paused. I need you to understand that everything I'm about to tell you is going to sound impossible. I need you to hear it anyway. You lost the right to need things from me 3 years ago. I know that too. The words came out without anger, which was somehow worse than if they'd been angry. She'd been prepared for anger. For the version of this conversation where he made demands or issued ultimatums or performed the wounded party. She had not been prepared for this. For the flat, exhausted honesty of a man who had stopped pretending anything was simple. She picked up the envelope, her name on the outside in Scarlett's handwriting, the particular looping S that Scarlett had never outgrown from childhood. She held it for a moment without opening it. Sit down, she said, and start from the beginning. What? He told her everything over the next 2 hours, which was long enough for the flat October light to leave the water and for the studio to go dim around them, and she lit the lamp on her work table and made coffee she didn't drink and listened. He told her that Scarlett had come to him 6 months ago. Not as a social call. Evelyn knew that Damien and her sister had stayed peripherally connected after Manhattan, in the way that people who move through the same professional circles can't entirely avoid each other. But with something specific. A document. A photograph of a document. Pages from what appeared to be a private financial ledger, handwritten, dated across a 20-year span, that Scarlett had found among their father's papers after Richard Hartwell had been briefly hospitalized in the spring for a cardiac event. The ledger, Damien said, was not in their father's handwriting. It was in his mother's. Victoria Sterling. He said the name with the particular neutrality of someone who had long since metabolized something too large for straightforward feeling. Evelyn had met Victoria Sterling exactly 4 times during her relationship with Damien. 4 times had been sufficient. Victoria Sterling was 71 years old and operated with the complete conviction that the world was a mechanism to be understood and utilized, that people were either useful or irrelevant, and that sentiment was a performance put on by those who lacked the intelligence to pursue their actual interests. She had been polite to Evelyn the way a surgeon is polite to a scalpel, functionally and without attachment. What was in the ledger? Evelyn said. Transactions, Damien said. Payments going back to before you and I met. Your father receiving money, substantial amounts, routed through a series of shell companies that trace back to a holding entity my mother controls. My father was taking money from your mother. For 22 years. Evelyn sat with that. In exchange for what? She said. Damien looked at her steadily. That's what Scarlett was trying to find out when she disappeared. She opened the envelope. Scarlett's letter was 3 pages, handwritten on plain paper, and it was written the way Scarlett wrote everything, fast and slightly tilted, thoughts running into each other, crossing lines when she ran out of space on one and had to continue somewhere else. Evelyn had spent her life reading Scarlett's handwriting, and she read it now the way you read something in a language you grew up speaking, automatically and without effort. The letter was not an explanation so much as a sequence of fragments. Things Scarlett had found, questions she hadn't been able to answer, the name of a warehouse in Brooklyn she'd been trying to get inside, a reference to a man named Cassius Brandt, who appeared in the ledger more than 40 times across 15 years. A sentence near the end that read, I know how it looks. I know what you thought you heard. Ev, it wasn't what you think. It was never what you think. Find Damien. I know that's the last thing you want to do. Do it anyway. Evelyn folded the letter. She set it on the work table. She looked at the cat, who was watching her from the windowsill with the particular expression cats have when they are observing the behavior of humans and finding it neither surprising nor reassuring. She says to find you, Evelyn said, as if I hadn't just found you sitting in my studio. I found you, Damien said. Semantics. I've been looking for you for 3 years, Evelyn. Don't. She stood up. Don't make this about us. There is no us. There hasn't been for 3 years. My sister is missing, and you're sitting here with information that might help find her, and that is the entire extent of what this is. He looked at her for a long moment. Okay, he said. Okay. She went to the window and looked out at the water. The cove was dark now, just the faint smear of light from the marina 2 miles off. She could hear the tide working against the rocks below the boathouse. Who is Cassius Brandt? She said. A name I've spent the last 6 months trying to source. He doesn't appear in any public record I've been able to find. My investigators think it may be an operational alias. Operational for what? That's the question. She pressed her forehead against the cold glass for a moment, briefly, then straightened up. The photographs, she said. Scarlett mentioned photographs in the ledger. There are photographs, yes. Surveillance images, of meetings. Some of them are from places I recognize. He paused. Some of them are of me. She turned from the window. Of you. At meetings I attended with my mother. Business discussions I understood to be legitimate at the time. I was present. I didn't understand what I was present for. His voice was level, but there was something beneath the levelness, something that had been living there for a while. I've spent the last 6 months trying to determine how much of my professional life has been built on architecture I didn't design and didn't know existed. And how much has? A pause. More than I want it to be. She studied him. He didn't look away. This was the thing about Damien Sterling that had always undone her. The fact that he didn't perform innocence. He didn't reach for the easy exculpatory version of himself. He sat with things. He let himself be seen sitting with them. It had always felt to her like the most honest thing about him, and she had loved it, and she had hated loving it because it made him very difficult to be angry with for very long. I need to go to New York, she said. I know. I'm not going for you. I understand that. Scarlett is the only reason. Yes. And when we find her, when, not if, I come back here, alone, and this is finished. He nodded slowly. Whatever you need. She looked at him for a moment longer. Then she turned to her work table and began carefully covering the ship's log, sealing the humidity enclosure, capping her consolidant, returning her tools to their positions. She did this with the same methodical attention she gave everything in this room, because the work deserved it, and because having a procedure to follow kept the part of her that was currently moving through deep and uncharted water from rising into her throat. I need to make arrangements for the cat, she said. Of course. And I'm driving my own car. That's fine. And you're not staying here tonight. I have a room in Damariscotta. She paused in her work. How long were you planning this before you came? A beat of silence. Long enough to know you might say no. She didn't respond to that. She kept moving, closing up the studio, turning off equipment, pulling the lock on the climate cabinet. The cat came and wound around her ankles, and she picked him up for a moment and held him against her collarbone, feeling his vibration against her sternum, before she set him down and went to call her neighbor about feeding him while she was gone. She stood in the small side room with her phone to her ear, listening to it ring, and looked through the doorway at the man sitting in her studio who had spoken her sister's name in his sleep 3 years ago on the 42nd floor of a building in Manhattan while a storm moved across the Hudson. She thought, I need to know which version of this story is true. She thought, I am not ready for either answer. Her neighbor picked up. She made the arrangements. She drove south in her 17-year-old truck with Damien's rental car a quarter-mile back in her rearview mirror for the entire 6-hour run down the coast. She kept the radio off. She drank gas station coffee at a rest stop in New Hampshire and ate something wrapped in plastic that was technically a sandwich and watched the traffic thicken as she crossed into Massachusetts and thickened again as she hit the Connecticut border and kept thickening all the way down toward New York, like the world was compressing itself around her as she got closer. She thought about Scarlett, younger by 4 years, which had meant everything when they were children and less as they got older. Scarlett, who was louder and warmer and more fearless, who had spent her 20s moving through rooms the way a bright thing moves through dim ones, drawing attention without asking for it. Scarlett, who had gone into investigative journalism and then left it for something she described vaguely as independent research that Evelyn had never entirely followed. Scarlett, who called irregularly and at odd hours, and whose voicemails were always either extremely brief or extremely long, with no middle ground. The last voicemail had been September 29th, 4 days before her phone went dead. Evelyn had listened to it so many times in the past 11 days that she could have recited it word for word, though she wouldn't. Hey, it's me. I know we haven't talked since August, and that's my fault. That's entirely my fault. There's a lot going on. I'm okay. I'll explain everything soon. I just wanted to hear your voice. A pause. The ambient sound of traffic somewhere. Be careful, Ev. I mean that. Be careful of... Just... be careful. She'd thought it was strange when she'd first heard it. She'd called back twice. No answer. She'd told herself Scarlett was being dramatic, which she sometimes was, and that the explanation would come with the eventual explanation of why she'd gone quiet for 2 months, which it always eventually did. She hadn't worried. Not really. Not until Damien had walked through her studio door. That she was going to have to sit with. She crossed into New York just after midnight. The city appeared on the horizon the way it always did. Not gradually, but all at once, a hard, bright line against the low clouds, asserting itself. She had not been back in 3 years, and she'd thought she'd feel more when she saw it. She felt tired. She felt the 6 hours of driving in her spine and her shoulders. She felt, more than anything, the particular tension of approaching something you've been pretending didn't exist. She took the bridge and came off into the city and drove through streets she knew by muscle memory even after 3 years. The muscle memory of a body that had lived somewhere long enough for it to leave a physical trace. She found the hotel Damien had sent to her phone in a text she'd read at the rest stop, and parked and checked in and went to her room and stood at the window for a while looking at the street below. The city was still moving at this hour. It always was. She took a shower and changed and sat on the edge of the bed with Scarlett's letter spread out in front of her on the coverlet, rereading the part she'd already memorized. The warehouse in Brooklyn, the name Cassius Brandt, the sentence about what she thought she'd heard. She picked up her phone and sent a text to Damien. 7 a.m. Tell me everything you know about the warehouse. His reply came back in under a minute. I'll be there. She turned off the light. She lay in the dark in a hotel room in a city she'd run from and stared at the ceiling and listened to New York doing what New York did outside the window. The sirens and the engines and the compressed human noise of 8 million people living on top of each other in the dark. And she told herself that she was here for Scarlett and only Scarlett, and that everything else was beside the point. She almost believed it. The photographs arrived under her hotel room door at 6:15 in the morning. She was already awake. She heard the soft friction of paper on carpet, and she was up and at the door in seconds, pulling it open to an empty hallway. Both directions. Carpet, and silence, and the distant ding of an elevator somewhere. She picked up the envelope. Plain manila, no writing on the outside. She opened it standing in the doorway and pulled out 5 photographs. 8 by 10, printed on matte paper, high resolution. The first photograph showed Damien Sterling entering a building she didn't recognize. Low, industrial, somewhere in what looked like the outer boroughs based on the skyline fragment visible above the roofline. He was wearing a coat she recognized. Recent, then. The past year. The second showed him at a table with 2 men she didn't know. One of them was large, gray-haired, with the physical bearing of someone who had spent most of his life being the largest person in whatever room he was in. The other was younger, lean, with a quality of stillness that read as either discipline or coldness. The third was a closer image of the same meeting. The large man had something on the table in front of him. Papers. A photograph within the photograph. The fourth showed Damien shaking the large man's hand. The fifth was different from the others. It wasn't a meeting. It was a street shot. Long lens, compressed perspective, the kind of image taken from a distance. Damien, on a sidewalk she didn't recognize, turned toward a woman. The woman had her back to the camera. Dark coat, dark hair. The woman's posture was familiar. Evelyn looked at the fifth photograph for a long time. She thought, I know how she stands. She thought, that's Scarlett. She stood in the doorway of her hotel room with the photographs in her hand and felt the cold air from the hallway on her bare feet, and something moved through her that wasn't entirely surprise and wasn't entirely dread, but was somewhere in the specific territory between the two where the things you already suspected on some level finally surface and demand to be addressed. She went inside. She laid all 5 photographs on the bed. She looked at them. Then she picked up her phone and called Damien's room, and when he answered, she said, her voice very even, Someone put photographs under my door, photographs of you, with men I don't recognize, and one of you with my sister. A pause. Start explaining now. The silence on the other end of the line lasted exactly 3 seconds. Then Damien said quietly, Don't leave your room. I'm coming up. She stood in the middle of the hotel room with the photographs on the bed and Scarlett's letter on the coverlet and the city moving outside the window, and she felt the walls of the situation contracting around her. Felt the specific narrowing of a moment when the number of possible directions you can move begins to reduce, one by one, until the only thing left is forward. She was not ready for forward. She was going forward anyway. Damien was at her door in 4 minutes. She knew because she watched the clock on the nightstand, with the particular focus of someone who needed something concrete to look at while everything else was moving. 4 minutes from the phone call to the knock. He'd been dressed already, or close enough to it. He came in wearing yesterday's shirt with the collar open and his coat thrown over it like an afterthought, his hair not entirely managed, and she could see from the way he moved that he hadn't slept much either. She stepped back from the door and let him in without speaking. He came in and went directly to the bed where the photographs were spread and stood over them with his hands loose at his sides and looked at them for a long time. She watched his face. She was very good at watching faces. It was part of the work. The ability to look at something old and damaged and read what it was telling you about how the damage had happened. She read his face now the way she read deteriorated documents, carefully, without rushing toward a conclusion. What she saw was not guilt. What she saw was recognition and calculation, and underneath both of those, something that looked like controlled fear. You know who these men are, she said. He didn't answer immediately. Damien. The large one is a man named Gerald Mast, he said. He runs a private security consulting firm out of Midtown. That's the legitimate description. The less legitimate description is that he facilitates introductions between people who need things done and people who do things. Things. Enforcement. Acquisition. Pressure. He paused. The kind of services that don't appear on a contract. She looked at the photographs again, at the handshake. And you were meeting with him. My mother set up this meeting 8 months ago. She told me Mast was a potential partner for a security infrastructure project tied to one of the Sterling portfolio companies. I attended. I shook his hand. I left. He looked at her. I didn't know what he was until Scarlett showed me the ledger, and I spent 4 months having someone trace every name in it. 4 months, Evelyn said. You spent 4 months investigating this, and you didn't tell me. I didn't know where you were. You could have found me sooner. You said it took a while. That implies you were looking. 4 months ago, you could have... She stopped. She pressed her lips together and made herself slow down. The younger man in the photograph. I don't know him. I've had people working on identifying him for 6 weeks, nothing solid. And the fifth photograph. She picked it up and held it out to him. Is that Scarlett? He took the photograph. He looked at it for a moment. Yes. So you met with her in the street? Multiple times. I told you she came to me. We were working together. That photograph was taken in September, 3 weeks before she disappeared. Someone was watching you. Someone has been watching both of us. Has been for a while, I think. He set the photograph back down on the bed. These were slid under your door, Evelyn. You've been in this city for less than 8 hours, and someone already knows which hotel and which room. She felt that land. She let it land completely, rather than deflecting it. Your phone, she said. I swept it this morning. Nothing. But that only tells you so much. Mine. Possibly. Or they followed me from Maine. Or they had someone watching the bridges last night. He looked at her steadily. Or there's a leak somewhere inside the people I've trusted with this. How many people is that? 3. My attorney, an investigator I've used for 8 years, and a former financial compliance officer who left Sterling Industries 2 years ago and has been cooperating with me voluntarily. Any of them could have, yes, any of them could have. He said it without flinching. I'm aware of that. She turned away from the bed and went to the window and looked out at the city in the early morning gray. The street below was filling up, people moving fast with coffee cups, a delivery truck double parked, the first of the morning cabs queuing at the corner. The ordinary machinery of the city running itself, indifferent to the fact that someone had pushed photographs under a hotel room door at 6 in the morning to tell her something she wasn't certain she was ready to understand. Scarlett said to be careful, Evelyn said, in her voicemail, the last one. When was that? September 29th. 4 days before her phone died. His voice shifted slightly. Not dramatically, just enough that she heard it. What did she say? She said she'd explain everything. She said she was okay. She said... Evelyn stopped. She said to be careful, and then she said, be careful of... And then she stopped herself. Like she started to say something specific and changed her mind. Silence. She knew she was being watched, Damien said, or she didn't want to say something on a phone that might not be private. Evelyn turned back from the window. The warehouse in her letter. You said you'd tell me everything you know about it. He moved to the small table by the window and pulled out a chair and sat down in it heavily, the way a person sits when they've been carrying something for too long. She noticed that, the weight of it. She pulled the other chair and sat across from him, close enough that they were almost knee to knee in the cramped space of the hotel room, and she waited. It's in Red Hook, he said, an industrial property on the waterfront. It used to be a cold storage facility, decommissioned in the 90s. It's been bought and sold several times through holding entities that are difficult to trace. The current owner of record is a property management company incorporated in Delaware with no physical address and no public-facing employees. But you know who it traces back to? I have a strong suspicion. I haven't been able to prove it yet. Say it anyway. He looked at her across the table. My mother. Evelyn breathed. Just breathed for a moment, slow and deliberate, the way she breathed when she was working on something she couldn't afford to damage. Scarlett called it the cage in her letter, she said. I know. I've seen the name in 2 other documents in the last month, both times without context. Just the name, referenced like a known location. She was trying to get inside it. She told me she'd found a way in, a contact who could get her access without triggering whatever security is there. He paused. That was the last thing she told me, 2 days before her phone went dead. Evelyn was quiet for a moment. If she got inside and found something, she began, then whoever owns it knows she found it. He didn't soften it. Yes. She stood up. She needed to move. She went to the small counter where the hotel coffee maker sat and started it running, not because she wanted coffee, but because doing something with her hands was necessary at this particular moment. She stood with her back to him and listened to the machine gurgle and thought about Scarlett trying to get inside a decommissioned cold storage building on the Red Hook waterfront, and what that meant about the 11 days that had passed since then. We need to go there, she said. I know. Today. I was going to suggest we wait until... Today, Damien. She turned around. She's been missing for 11 days. If you were going to suggest we wait for some optimal window, you can keep that thought to yourself. He looked at her for a moment. Then he nodded once. Today. But not alone. I have someone I want to bring. Who? A man named Ray Calder, former NYPD. He did 20 years in organized crime investigation before he left the department. He's been helping me build the evidentiary picture on my mother's network for the past 14 months. He knows the Red Hook property. He's surveilled it twice. Can you trust him? The question sat between them. I've trusted him for 14 months, Damien said. That's all I can tell you. That's not the same thing. No, he agreed. It isn't. She poured coffee into the single cup the machine had produced and wrapped both hands around it and thought about trust and what it was worth and how you calculated it when you were standing in a hotel room in a city you'd fled from with photographs on the bed and your sister somewhere unknown. Call him, she said. We leave in 2 hours. Ray Calder was 54 and looked like someone who had been compressed by decades of looking at ugly things without being destroyed by them, which was either a testament to his character or evidence of a particular kind of emotional compartmentalization that could go either way depending on your view of such things. He was medium height and square-built, with close-cut gray hair and the kind of eyes that registered everything and gave back very little. He met them in the parking structure 2 blocks from the hotel at 9 in the morning, and he shook Evelyn's hand with a directness she appreciated and didn't make a production of the introduction. "Dr. Hartwell," he said. "Evelyn." He nodded. He looked at Damien. "The photographs. She got them this morning. Anyone touched the envelope before you?" "No," Evelyn said. "I opened it myself." "Where is it now?" "Hotel room, on the table." "I'll want to look at it before we move." He glanced at Damien again, a look that carried information she wasn't entirely fluent in yet. "We have a problem." "What kind?" "My contact at the 2nd Precinct flagged something this morning. There was an inquiry run on your name yesterday evening." He said it to Evelyn. "Someone pulled your main driver's license through a law enforcement database. Not a standard check, a targeted pull. The access log shows it came from inside the NYPD, but the user credentials used are attached to an officer who retired 14 months ago." Evelyn felt the information settle into her understanding of the morning and make it worse in a specific way. "Someone used a dead account to look me up," she said. "Yes, which means someone inside or with access to NYPD systems knew you were coming and wanted to confirm your current address without leaving a traceable name attached to the search." He paused. "This is not a small operation, Ms. Hartwell. Whatever your sister found or was looking for, the people involved have reach." "Tell me something I don't know," she said. He looked at her steadily. "Your father was in New York 3 days ago." The parking structure was cold and smelled of exhaust and damp concrete, and she stood in it and felt that sentence move through her like a current. "My father," she said carefully, "lives in Connecticut." "He does. He came into the city on October 14th, stayed at the Mercer in Soho, met with 2 individuals at a private dining room in a restaurant on Crosby Street. One of the individuals was Gerald Mast." A pause. "I don't yet know who the second person was." She looked at Damien. He was looking at her. His face was doing the thing it did, the not looking away thing, the sitting with it thing, and she felt a flash of something old and involuntary move through her chest, which she immediately suppressed. "My father," she said again, slower this time, working through it, "was meeting with a man who appears in photographs with you, who appears in my sister's ledger, 3 days after Scarlett disappeared." "Yes," Calder said, "and my father has been receiving payments from Victoria Sterling for 22 years. Calder's eyes moved to Damien. "You told her." "Everything I know," Damien said. Calder looked back at Evelyn. Something moved in his expression, not quite pity, not quite admiration, something in between. "Then you understand the scope of what we're dealing with." "I understand that my father and your mother," she said to Damien, keeping her voice absolutely flat, "have had a financial relationship for over 2 decades that neither of them saw fit to mention to either of us. I understand that my sister found evidence of this relationship and is now missing. I understand that someone slid photographs under my door this morning that were clearly intended to make me suspicious of you." She looked at Damien. "Which is an interesting choice if the people behind this wanted me gone. They could have just threatened me. Instead, they sent photographs designed to make me doubt you specifically." Damien said nothing. "Why would they want me to doubt you?" she said. "What does that accomplish?" "It splits us up," Calder said quietly. "If you don't trust him, you don't work with him. You go back to Maine, you're out of the picture, and he's isolated," Damien said. "That's easier to manage alone." Evelyn looked at the photograph she was still holding. The 5th one. Her sister's back. The familiar posture. "They've been managing you for a while," she said to Damien. "It wasn't an accusation exactly. It was a diagnosis." He didn't argue with it. "Yes, and you let them. I didn't know the full shape of it until Scarlett showed you the ledger 6 months ago." She looked at him. "What were you doing before that, when you didn't know the full shape of it?" His jaw tightened slightly. "Running the company my father built and my mother controlled. Attending the meetings I was told to attend, signing the documents that were put in front of me. A beat. Being managed." Did you ever ask questions? I asked questions I was given acceptable answers to. His voice had an edge now. Not anger at her, she could tell the difference. Anger at the memory of his own compliance. I was not stupid, Evelyn. I wasn't naive. I knew my mother operated in ways that weren't always clean. I chose to understand that as business pragmatism. I chose to believe there was a line she wouldn't cross. He stopped. Scarlett's ledger told me there was no line. She held his gaze for a moment longer. Then she turned to Calder. What do we need to go to Red Hook? They went at noon. Calder drove. Evelyn sat in the passenger seat and Damien sat behind her, and none of them said much as they crossed Brooklyn and came down through Carroll Gardens and into Red Hook, the neighborhood shifting as they moved south. The boutiques and coffee shops giving way to warehouses and loading docks, and the low industrial smell of the waterfront. The streets getting wider and emptier, the sky opening up as the buildings got shorter. The cage was a squat, wide structure 3 blocks from the water. From the outside, it was unremarkable. Corrugated metal cladding painted a faded industrial green, no visible windows on the street-facing side, a loading dock with a roll door that had been welded shut at some point in the past. The only entrance Calder had identified in his surveillance was a personnel door on the north side, accessed from a narrow alley between the warehouse and the chain-link fence of a derelict lot next door. Calder parked 2 blocks away and they sat in the car for a few minutes while he looked at something on his phone. The motion sensor on the north door was active as of last Tuesday, he said, which means someone either came or went around that date. Tuesday was October 15th, Damien said, 2 days after my father, after Richard Hartwell was in the city. Evelyn didn't react to the correction. How did you get motion sensor data? I have a device placed on the utility conduit running along the alley. It picks up electromagnetic signatures from the door hardware. He glanced at her. I've been waiting for a reason to go in. What were you waiting for? Someone to go in with who had a reason to be there that wasn't just me. He looked at Damien in the rear-view mirror. No offense. None taken, Damien said. They walked to the building separately. Calder first, then Evelyn, then Damien after a 2-minute gap, and met in the alley on the north side. The alley was in shadow despite the noon hour, the sun not reaching between the buildings, the concrete still dark from last night's rain. It smelled of salt water and rust, and something else beneath those, something chemical and faintly wrong that Evelyn noted without identifying. The personnel door had a keypad and a deadbolt. Calder produced a small device from his jacket that he held against the keypad for approximately 30 seconds before the light went from red to green. He looked at the deadbolt. Shimmied, he said quietly, and she saw then that the bolt wasn't fully seated. Someone had been here before them and left it open, or left it available. Calder looked at Damien. Damien looked at the door. Neither of them said what they were both thinking. Evelyn pushed the door open. The inside of the cage was not what she'd expected. She'd expected empty space, a derelict interior matching the derelict exterior. She'd expected dust and cold and the gutted remains of whatever industrial function the building had once served. The interior had been renovated, not expensively, not a luxury renovation, but thoroughly. The walls were drywalled and painted. The floor was sealed concrete. There were fluorescent lights overhead, not currently running, and the light coming through the open door behind them was sufficient to see by, barely. There were shelving units along 2 walls, metal, industrial, and they were not empty. She walked to the nearest shelf. Files. Banker's boxes, labeled in a handwriting she didn't recognize. The labels giving dates spanning 15 years. Photographs in protective sleeves. Binders with colored tabs. A stack of small hardbound notebooks, the kind you bought in bulk, the kind that were used for field work. She picked up the nearest notebook. Inside the front cover, in handwriting she recognized immediately, were 2 words, Cassius Brandt. And below that, in smaller letters, if found, E-H only, E-H. Evelyn Hartwell. Her hands were steady. She was proud of that. Her hands were steady, and her breathing was careful, and she turned to Damien and Calder, who were moving through the space behind her, and she said with a flatness that cost her something, Scarlett was here. This was her operation, this whole room. Calder stopped moving. Damien looked at her from across the space. She built this, Evelyn said, holding up the notebook. She's been building this. For Look at these dates. She gestured at the boxes on the shelf. Some of these go back 8 years. She's been doing this for 8 years. Her voice stayed flat. The flatness required continuous effort. While I was in Maine restoring books, my sister was running a one-person investigation into a criminal network that touches our family and your family, and apparently a man who may or may not exist named Cassius Brandt. The silence in the room had a quality to it. Then Calder said from the far end of the shelving, "Damien." Something in the way he said it. They both moved toward him. He was standing in front of the last shelving unit, looking at something on the middle shelf. He stepped aside when they reached him and let them see. A laptop, open. Screensaver running, just the clock, white digits on black. The time reading 12:14 p.m., not sleeping. Running. Someone had been here recently enough to leave it active. And beside the laptop, held down by a single smooth riverstone acting as a paperweight, was a folded piece of paper. Calder put on a glove before he touched it. He unfolded it carefully and held it so they could both read it. 4 words, handwritten in a hand that was not Scarlett's. She told us everything. Told us. The door at the far end of the room, a door neither of them had seen because it was set into the wall without visible hardware, opened. 3 men came through it. The large one in front was Gerald Mast. He looked at Evelyn with the particular expression of someone who has been waiting in a room for the right people to arrive and has just confirmed that they have. "Dr. Hartwell," he said. "We've been expecting." Nobody moved for a full 3 seconds. Evelyn counted them. She did not know why she counted them except that her mind required something concrete to hold on to. In the moment that Gerald Mast stepped through the door with 2 men behind him, and the room contracted around the 4 of them like a fist closing. Calder moved first. He shifted his weight almost imperceptibly. A small adjustment, his right hand dropping toward his jacket. And Mast said without raising his voice, "I wouldn't." The man to Mast's left had a weapon already out. Not raised, just present. The message was sufficient. Calder's hand stopped. "Thank you," Mast said, with the particular courtesy of someone who had run this kind of room many times before and found that politeness made things more efficient. He was larger than the photographs had suggested, not just in height, but in the density of him, the way he occupied space. He wore a dark overcoat and no tie, and his gray hair was cut close to a skull that looked like it had been designed for durability. He looked at Evelyn with an expression of mild assessment, the way you looked at something you'd been told about, and were now seeing in person for the first time. "Dr. Hartwell," he said again, "I've read quite a bit about your work, the Pemberton Collection restoration." "That was yours, yes? The 18th century correspondence?" She stared at him. "The ink consolidation work was apparently exceptional," he said. "Someone with a great deal of patience." "Where's my sister?" Evelyn said. Mast looked at her for a moment, then he looked at Damien. "Mr. Sterling, I want you to understand that this conversation is going to go considerably better for everyone if you accept that the situation has already been resolved and we're simply here to discuss the terms of moving forward." "Terms," Damien said. His voice was perfectly controlled. She could hear what that control was costing him underneath it. "Your mother sends her regards." The silence that followed was the kind that had weight. "She's here," Damien said. It wasn't a question. "She's nearby." Mast moved to the center of the room with the unhurried movement of a man who had calculated all available exits and found none of them concerning. He looked at the shelving units, at Scarlett's years of accumulated work, with an expression that was almost appreciative. "Your sister-in-law," he said to Evelyn, "was remarkably thorough. It took us considerably longer than it should have to identify the full scope of what she'd assembled." "She's not my sister-in-law," Evelyn said. "Not yet." He smiled briefly. "My apologies," Calder said quietly and without moving. "What do you want, Mast?" "What I want is straightforward. What Mrs. Sterling wants is somewhat more complex, but she prefers to explain that herself." He looked at the door he'd come through. "She's asked me to bring you." "And if we decline?" Damien said. Mast looked at him with an expression that was almost paternal in its patience. "Mr. Sterling, your mother's been 3 steps ahead of this investigation for 14 months. She's known about Mr. Calder since the beginning. She's known about the ledger since 2 days after your sister, since Miss Hartwell showed it to you." A pause. She's been allowing this to proceed because it served her purposes to do so. You were never investigating her. You were performing an investigation that she was observing. Damien said nothing. The only variable she didn't anticipate, Mass said, glancing at Evelyn, was you, which is why you're here, rather than having been discouraged from coming. You represent a genuine unknown. Mrs. Sterling finds that interesting. He gestured toward the far door. She'd like to meet you properly. Evelyn looked at the door. She looked at Calder, who was watching Mast with the specific stillness of a man calculating odds and not liking what he was coming up with. She looked at Damien. His eyes were on her. There was something in them she recognized from 3 years ago. The thing he did when he was carrying the full weight of something and choosing not to put it down on someone else. She had loved that about him and resented it in equal measure. The stubborn, private load-bearing of it. She looked back at Mast. If anything happens to any of us, she said, the evidence in this room goes public. The evidence in this room, Mast said, has already been copied, cataloged, and secured in a location that is not this room. What you're looking at now are the originals, yes, but they are no longer the only set. He let that settle. Mrs. Sterling is thorough. Evelyn breathed. She thought, Scarlett spent 8 years building this. She thought, and they walked in and copied it and left the originals here like a calling card. She thought, they wanted us to find this room, the shimmied lock, the running laptop, the note. You led us here, she said. Mast didn't confirm or deny. He simply gestured toward the door again. They went through it. Odd. The room on the other side was different from the archive. It was smaller and furnished, not well, but deliberately. A table, chairs, a standing lamp in the corner that produced a warm and incongruous light, a tray with a water pitcher and glasses on the table. It had the quality of a room that had been prepared for a specific meeting, which was exactly what it was. Victoria Sterling stood at the far end of it with her back to them, looking at something on the wall that turned out, when Evelyn got close enough to see it, to be a photograph. A large framed photograph of a younger version of a man Evelyn recognized as Damien's father. Lawrence Sterling, who had died 11 years ago of a heart attack at 63, which was the official story, which Evelyn was now recontextualizing in real time. Victoria turned when they entered. She was 71 and looked 60 and moved like 50, and Evelyn had always thought there was something almost architectural about her. The way she was constructed, the way she held herself, as if every element of her physical presentation had been engineered rather than simply lived. She wore a charcoal suit. Her white hair was precisely arranged. Her face showed nothing that she hadn't chosen to show. She looked at Damien first. Something passed across her face, briefly, quickly, something that in a different woman Evelyn might have called grief. And then it was gone. Damien, she said. Don't, he said. I'm not going to apologize. You know I won't. I know. She looked at Evelyn then. A long, considered look. The kind of look that cataloged and assessed without being overtly invasive. Dr. Hartwell, I've been wanting to speak with you for quite some time. Where is Scarlett? Evelyn said. She's safe. She's being kept in a medical facility upstate. She is unharmed. Victoria said this with the same tone she might use to confirm a business arrangement. Her safety is contingent on this conversation going well. I want you to understand that clearly from the beginning so that we don't waste time pretending the stakes are different from what they are. Evelyn felt the room do something to her internal temperature. She kept her face still. Sit down, Victoria said. Please, I'm 71. I prefer conversations where everyone is seated. Nobody sat. A small flicker of something, not quite amusement, crossed Victoria's face. All right. She moved to the table and poured herself a glass of water and stood with it and looked at them with the patience of someone who had spent 5 decades being the most prepared person in any given room. What I'm about to tell you is not a confession, she said. I want that distinction understood. It is an explanation, provided because I believe you are at the point where the explanation will be more useful to you than the mystery, and because certain decisions need to be made before the end of this week. She looked at Damien. Your father did not die of a heart attack. The room stopped. Damien looked at his mother. He was dying, she said without inflection. The heart attack was real. The first one. 3 months before. He had perhaps 4 months remaining. He was in significant pain. What happened at the end was something he chose and something I facilitated. A pause. I want you to understand that he asked me. I want you to understand that I did not want to. I want you to understand that I have not slept soundly since. She said this last part with the particular precision of someone describing a practical consequence rather than asking for sympathy. But I did it, and Richard Hartwell was there when I did. And that is the original binding. That is where all of it began. Evelyn said, "My father watched you." "Your father assisted me," Victoria said. "Yes, in exchange for which I made certain that his business interests were protected, that his debts, and he had substantial debts, were absorbed, that his daughters had futures." She looked at Evelyn directly. "Your graduate fellowship, the conservancy grant that funded your first independent work, your sister's early journalism career, the doors that opened. I opened them, Dr. Hartwell. Your father could not afford to open them himself. The water pitcher on the table, the glasses, the warm light from the corner lamp. These ordinary things arranged around an extraordinary statement." Evelyn looked at them and felt something inside her shift on its foundation. "You've been managing us," she said. "All of us. For how long?" "Since you were in your 20s. You manipulated Damien and me." Victoria's expression didn't change. "I ensured that the relationship developed in a way that was controllable. I didn't engineer the attachment. That was genuine, which frankly created complications I hadn't anticipated." A beat. "What I did engineer was the ending. The ending. The night. The storm. The name whispered in the dark." Evelyn felt it arrive. That's the full weight of what was being said, and she let it arrive completely rather than turning away from it. She was very good at that, at standing in the full presence of something terrible and not flinching. "You were there," Evelyn said slowly. "That night. In the penthouse." Victoria set down her water glass. "I was not physically present, but you arranged it." A pause, just long enough to confirm what didn't need confirming. "Damien talks in his sleep," Evelyn said. Her voice sounded strange to her, far away and very clear at the same time. "You knew that. You knew I'd hear. You put your people in place to—" "What? Record the room. Someone in the building. A staff member. Someone in the—" She stopped. "You played a recording." Victoria said nothing. "You played a recording of him saying her name." Evelyn heard her own voice go somewhere she hadn't intended. "He never said it. You made me hear it. You made me—" She stopped again. She pressed her lips together. Her hands, she discovered, were shaking. She looked at them with a distant, dispassionate interest, the way she looked at things that were behaving unexpectedly, and she made them stop. She made them stop because the alternative was not acceptable in this room. 3 years, she said. I left because of something that never happened. Yes, Victoria said. Damien made a sound. Not a word. Something below a word. Something that came from a place where words hadn't been built yet. He turned away from the table and stood with his back to the room and his hands at his sides, and she could see the line of his shoulders doing something, the muscles across them working against each other. And she understood that he was doing the same thing she was doing, holding it, keeping the shape of himself intact by main force. Why? Evelyn said. Why go to the trouble? Why not just— Because he wouldn't have ended it, Victoria said, with a directness that was almost brutal in its simplicity. I tried less elaborate methods first. He didn't respond to them. Damien has a particular quality of stubbornness where his personal attachments are concerned. I needed something that would make you leave rather than him, because if I'd tried to make him leave you, he would have fought it, and the conflict would have been visible and inconvenient. She looked at Evelyn with something that wasn't apology and wasn't entirely without remorse. You, I calculated, would leave quietly. You would not make a scene. You would disappear. But itam, and I did. You did? Because I believed I wasn't enough, Evelyn said. Because you knew that about me. You studied that. Victoria didn't answer. You knew exactly which wound to reopen, Evelyn said. The lamp in the corner hummed. Somewhere beyond the walls of the building, the waterfront moved, gulls and water, and the low machinery of the harbor. Calder spoke for the first time since they'd sat down. He hadn't sat, either. He'd remained near the door they'd come through, and he spoke now from that position in a voice that was deliberately calm. You said decisions needed to be made before the end of the week. What decisions? Victoria looked at him with the expression she reserved, Evelyn suspected, for people she found useful but not interesting. The investigation that Damien has been building will be submitted to the U.S. Attorney's Office within 5 days. I know this because I know everything that has been prepared and by whom. She looked at Damien's back. If that submission proceeds, certain documents will surface that implicate not only my network but the Hartwell family. Richard will face criminal exposure. The girls' histories, the grants, the fellowships, the funded careers will be examined as potential money laundering vehicles. Scarlett's investigative work will be characterized as a conflict of interest. Everything she built in that room will be compromised as evidence. She paused. I'm offering a different path. Damien turned around. His face was composed now. She could see what the composure had cost him. It was in the tightness around his eyes and the set of his jaw and the way he was breathing. But it was there. What path? He said. You withdraw the submission. The investigation ends. Scarlett comes home. Your father, your biological father, the Sterling name, the empire, continues operating under a restructuring arrangement that I have already designed, which removes the most legally exposed elements while preserving the core. She looked at Evelyn. You return to Maine. You stay there. You don't publish, don't speak, don't cooperate with any future inquiry. The room waited. And in exchange, Evelyn said, you continue to operate. In a reduced capacity. I'm 71, Dr. Hartwell. I'm not interested in expansion. I'm interested in legacy. You're interested in not going to prison, Calder said. Victoria looked at him. Yes, among other things. Evelyn looked at Damien. He was looking at her. They were standing 8 feet apart in a room where everything that had ever been wrong between them had just been explained and attributed to a source that was standing in the same space, and she felt the particular vertigo of a moment when the story you've been living in turns out to have had a different author than you thought. She thought about Scarlett. 11 days. A medical facility upstate. Unharmed. She thought about 8 years of files on metal shelves, a woman working alone toward something enormous. She thought about a recording, a voice in the dark, a name that was never spoken. She looked at Victoria Sterling, who was watching her with the clear-eyed patience of someone who believed she had already won. You made a mistake, Evelyn said. Victoria raised an eyebrow slightly. You told me, Evelyn said. You just told me everything. You explained the mechanism. You showed me exactly how it was done. She looked at Damien. You did that because you believe I'm still the woman who left quietly, the woman who disappears. She looked back at Victoria. You haven't accounted for the fact that 3 years of very quiet, very patient work changes a person's relationship to what they're capable of sustaining. Victoria looked at her. I spent 3 years learning how to save things that everyone else had given up on, Evelyn said. Things that were falling apart at the molecular level, things that required a different approach from every standard method. She paused. I'm very good at it. The silence in the room was different from the silences before it. Then Mast opened the door at the far end, the door Victoria had entered from, and 2 more men came through it, and the calculation of the room changed completely, and Evelyn felt the situation arrive at the specific point she had been moving toward since she'd opened that hotel room door that morning and found photographs on the floor. The point where the only remaining question was not whether she was willing to do what came next. The point where the only question was whether she was capable of it. She looked at Calder. He looked back at her with the eyes of a man who had spent 20 years in rooms like this and knew the exact moment when a conversation ended and something else. Calder moved before the second man was fully through the door. It was not a large movement. It was a precise one. A single step left that took him out of the direct line between the 2 new men and the table. And his hand came out of his jacket with something in it, and he said in a voice stripped of everything except information, Down, both of you, now. The man on the left stopped. The man on the right did not. What followed lasted approximately 4 seconds and was not clean. Calder was 54 and had spent 20 years learning how to end physical confrontations before they became extended, and the man coming through the door was younger and larger and had not learned the same things. The collision between these two facts resolved itself against the wall beside the door, with a sound that was mostly impact and a little bit of breath leaving a body involuntarily. And then the younger, larger man was on the floor and Calder was standing over him, breathing harder than he had been 30 seconds ago, and the something in his hand was pointed at the man on the left who had made the correct decision and stopped. Mast had not moved. He stood near Victoria with his hands visible, which told Evelyn something about his calculation of the room that she filed away. Damien had moved during the 4 seconds, not toward the violence but toward Evelyn, putting himself between her and the door Victoria had used, which was either instinct or strategy, and possibly both. She felt him close behind her. She didn't move away. "Gerald," Victoria said. "Mrs. Sterling?" His voice was even. He was looking at Calder. "Stand down," she said. Something passed across Mast's face, a fraction of resistance, quickly resolved. He looked at the man still standing near the door and gave a small gesture. The man's posture changed, not fully at ease, but the specific tension of imminent action went out of it. Calder did not lower what was in his hand. "Ray," Damien said quietly. "Not yet," Calder said. The room held its configuration. The man on the floor was conscious and making careful decisions about remaining still. The lamp in the corner kept its warm and incongruous light. Victoria Sterling stood with her water glass and her posture and her 71 years of having been the most prepared person in every room, and looked at Calder with an expression that had moved past annoyance into something more considered. "You have a weapon," she said to him. "Gerald has 4 men in this building. There are 2 more outside. Whatever you're calculating, the math doesn't favor you." "The math hasn't favored me in 20 years, Calder said. "I'm comfortable with it." Evelyn stepped forward, not toward the door, toward the table. She moved deliberately and without rushing, and she pulled out a chair and she sat down in it, and the very ordinariness of the action, the simple act of sitting at a table in the middle of everything, pulled the room's attention to her in a way that was more effective than anything louder would have been. She put both hands flat on the table. She looked at Victoria. "You want a negotiation?" she said. "So let's negotiate." Victoria looked at her for a moment. Then she pulled out the chair across from Evelyn and sat down in it. The 2 of them at opposite ends of a table in a warehouse in Red Hook, while the men around them did whatever men did when women were deciding things. "You have Scarlett," Evelyn said. "We have 14 months of your financial architecture and the names of everyone you've moved money through. Those are the positions. Start talking about what a trade actually looks like." "I already told you what it looks like," Victoria said. "You told me what you wanted. That's not the same thing." Evelyn kept her hands flat on the table. The shaking was gone. She didn't know exactly when it had gone, but it was gone. Damien withdrawing the submission doesn't make the information disappear. It makes it dormant, which means you spend the rest of your life managing a dormant threat. That's not a resolution. That's a different kind of prison. Victoria's eyes moved to her hands on the table and back to her face. Something in her expression shifted, fractionally, barely perceptibly, but Evelyn caught it. "What are you proposing?" Victoria said. "I'm proposing that you tell me where Scarlett is, right now, not as a condition of something else, just as a demonstration that she's actually safe and you actually have the ability to return her, because until I verify that with my own eyes, everything else we discuss is hypothetical." That's how this works for me," Evelyn said. "Or we stop talking and Damien submits everything he has to the U.S. attorney in the next 20 minutes through a channel you haven't compromised, because you haven't compromised all of them. You've just compromised the ones you know about." She paused. "Do you want to test whether that's true?" The silence had a different quality now. Victoria Sterling looked at Evelyn Hartwell across the table, and Evelyn looked back, and neither of them blinked. And the room was very quiet except for the harbor sounds through the walls, and the lamp and the careful breathing of men who were waiting to see which way it broke. Then Victoria said, "Gerald, call the facility, Ted." The facility was 2 hours north. They drove in 2 cars, Calder driving Evelyn and Damien in the first, Mast following with one of his men in the second. The arrangement negotiated with the particular exhausted pragmatism of people who had run out of better options. Victoria did not come. She remained at the cage with the understanding, made explicit by Damien in 3 flat sentences before they left, that if Scarlett was not where she was said to be, and in the condition she was said to be in, Every piece of evidence his team had assembled would be transmitted simultaneously to 6 separate recipients within the hour. Whether Victoria believed he could execute that from a moving car was a question Evelyn watched him not answer, which was its own kind of answer. They drove north through Brooklyn and up through the city and onto the interstate, and the afternoon was flat and gray, and the trees along the highway were past peak color, the leaves going brown and brittle at their edges. Evelyn sat in the passenger seat and watched the mile markers, and did not speak for the first 40 minutes. Damien sat behind her. He hadn't spoken since the cage either. She was aware of him the way you were aware of weather, as a presence, a pressure in the atmosphere, something that was happening whether you looked at it directly or not. At the 40-minute mark, she said, "Are you all right?" A pause. "No," he said. "Okay." Another mile. The highway opened up north of the city, and the sky got bigger. "She knew since the beginning," he said. His voice had a specific quality, the quality of something that had been held under pressure for so long that the release of it was almost inaudible. "Every meeting I thought I was running, every decision I thought I was making." "Not everyone," Evelyn said. "How do you know that?" "Because she had to manufacture a reason to get rid of me. If she'd had real control of you, she would have found a way to make you end it yourself. She couldn't, so she went around you." Evelyn watched the road. "That's not nothing." Silence. "She played a recording," he said. "In my own bedroom. In my own—" He stopped. "Someone on my staff. Someone I trusted enough to have in my home." "We'll find out who." "I know who," he said. "I've known since this morning, and I've been sitting with it for 6 hours, and I don't—" His voice broke slightly, not with grief, but with the effort of containing something that was too large for the container. "It was my assistant, Daniel. He's been with me for 9 years." Calder said nothing. His eyes stayed on the road. Evelyn turned in her seat and looked at Damien directly for the first time since the warehouse. He was looking out the window at the passing trees with an expression that was doing something she recognized, the expression of a person reorganizing their understanding of their own history, going back through it room by room and re-examining what was real. She had spent 3 years doing that exact thing. She knew the face it made. "Damien," she said. He looked at her. "Later," she said. "All of it. Later. Right now we go get Scarlett." He held her gaze for a moment. Then he nodded once, the small decisive nod of someone choosing to put something down temporarily and trust it will still be there when they come back for it. She turned back to face the road. The facility appeared off an unmarked private drive between 2 stands of old pine, a low modern building set back from the road, institutional in its clean lines and deliberate anonymity. A sign at the entrance said only a suite number and a management company name. No medical indicators. Nothing that would tell you what it was from the outside. Mass made a call from the second car before they turned off the highway, and by the time they reached the entrance gate, there was a man waiting to wave them through. The transaction had the rehearsed quality of something that had been done before. Evelyn noted that and stored it. They parked. Calder got out first and stood by the car with his coat open and his eyes moving across the grounds in a systematic sweep. Entrance points, sight lines, the number of personnel visible. Evelyn counted 3 outside. There would be more inside. Mass came up beside them. "She's in a private suite on the 2nd floor. She's been told you're coming. He paused. "She's been cooperative throughout. I want you to know that. She wasn't harmed." Evelyn looked at him. "Cooperative," she said. "You're using that word about my sister who you've held in a facility for 11 days against her will, and you want me to understand it as reassuring." Mass didn't respond to that. They went inside. The interior was clean and quiet, the particular quiet of a building designed to be calm. A reception desk, soft lighting, a man in a plain suit who nodded at Mast and led them to an elevator without speaking. 2nd floor. A corridor. A door at the end of it. The man knocked twice and opened it. Evelyn went through first. The suite was larger than she'd expected. A sitting room, a window looking out at the pine trees, furniture that was trying for comfortable and mostly achieving functional. And in the chair by the window, with her feet pulled up under her and a blanket across her lap, and a paperback open face down on the arm of the chair like she'd just set it down. Scarlett. She looked up when Evelyn came through the door. For a moment, neither of them moved. Scarlett was thinner. Her face had the specific quality of someone who had been running on controlled anxiety for an extended period. A tightness around the eyes, a sharpness in the jaw that wasn't usually there. Her dark hair was pulled back roughly. She was wearing clothes that weren't hers. Plain, institutional, the kind of thing that had been provided rather than chosen. But she was upright, and her eyes were clear. And when she saw Evelyn, her face did something complicated and fast. Relief and guilt, and the specific expression of a person who has been holding something in for 11 days and is only now being given permission to let it go. "Hey," Scarlett said. Her voice was rougher than usual. "Hey," Evelyn said. She crossed the room and sat on the edge of the chair and put her arms around her sister, and Scarlett leaned into it with a force that told her everything. The careful expression had been concealing, and they stayed like that for a moment while Damien and Calder came into the room behind them and Mass stayed in the doorway, and the pine trees moved in the gray afternoon light outside the window. Then Scarlett pulled back and looked past Evelyn at Damien, and something moved between them. A look that carried information Evelyn wasn't fully fluent in yet. The look of two people who had been working towards something together and were now measuring what the work had cost. "You told her," Scarlett said to him. "Everything I knew," he said. "She told you the rest," Scarlett said. It wasn't a question. "Victoria explained the mechanism," Evelyn said carefully. Scarlett looked at her. Later," Evelyn said, the same word she'd used in the car. "We're not doing any of that here." Scarlett read her face. She nodded. "Okay, later." She glanced at Mast in the doorway. "Are we leaving?" "That depends on the next conversation," Damien said. Scarlett looked at him. "She's not going to let us walk out with everything. She's going to try to negotiate." "She's been negotiating for 40 years, Scarlett said. "She negotiated your father into an early grave and our father into 20 years of indentured servitude, and the two of you into—" She stopped. She looked at Evelyn, and then at Damien, and then back at Evelyn. "Does she know about the secondary set?" The room shifted. Evelyn looked at Scarlett. "What secondary set?" Scarlett looked at Damien. "Tell her," Damien said. Scarlett pulled the blanket off her lap and put her feet on the floor and sat forward with her elbows on her knees. "The files in the cage, the ones Victoria copied, those aren't the complete record." She looked at Evelyn steadily. "I knew someone would find that room eventually. I didn't know if it would be us or them first. So everything in that room is accurate, but it's not everything. The complete record, the ledger originals, the photographs with full provenance documentation, the financial flow analysis going back 22 years is somewhere else." "Where?" Evelyn said. A pause. "With Dad," Scarlett said. Evelyn heard that. She sat with it. "You gave the complete evidence set to our father," she said. "I gave him a sealed package 14 months ago and told him to keep it and tell no one, and that if anything happened to me, he should open it and act on it. I told him it was research materials for a project." Scarlett's voice was steady, but something underneath it was not. "I didn't tell him what it was." "He met with Mast 3 days ago," Evelyn said. "Dad was in New York. He met with Gerald Mast at a restaurant in Soho." Scarlett went still. 3 days ago," she said. "October 14th. The color didn't leave Scarlett's face exactly. It reorganized. The expression on it became very careful and very fast at the same time, the look of someone running a calculation that was coming up with answers they didn't want. "He opened it," she said. "We don't know that. If he met with Mast, he opened it. She got to him." Scarlett stood up. "She got to him, and now she has the complete set, and she knows she has everything, and that's why she's willing to negotiate, because she's already won. She's already—" "Scarlett." Damien's voice was quiet and flat, and it stopped her. "She doesn't have it." Scarlett looked at him. "Your father came to me," Damien said, 10 days ago. "The day before your phone went dead. He came to my office, and he told me you'd given him a package and that someone had approached him about it, and he didn't know what to do." He paused. "I took the package. I have it. It's not in New York." The room breathed. "Why didn't you tell me?" Evelyn said. She heard the edge in her own voice and didn't remove it. "I found out the day before I came to Maine," he said. "I was still working out what it meant. I needed to see what Scarlett had in the cage before I understood how the two sets fit together." You knew you had the complete evidence, and you still walked into the cage. I walked into the cage because you were walking into it, he said, and because Scarlett was here, and we needed her out. He looked at her steadily. The evidence is with my attorney. Not the one Victoria knows about. Someone else. Someone I put in place 14 months ago, specifically because I knew there would come a point where the known channels were compromised. Mass spoke from the doorway. His voice had changed. The deliberate courtesy was still there, but beneath it something else had surfaced. A tightening, a recalibration. Mr. Sterling, I need to make a call. I know you do, Damien said. This changes. I know what it changes. Mass looked at him for a moment. Then he stepped back into the corridor and pulled out his phone. Calder moved to the door and watched him through the gap. Evelyn looked at Damien. He was looking at her. The distance between them in the room was 8 feet. The same distance as in the warehouse. The same distance as in the hotel room that morning. The same distance they'd been keeping since Maine, as if there was a line drawn at 8 feet that neither of them had been willing to cross. She still has leverage, Evelyn said quietly. Your submission to the U.S. attorney, if the evidence you have on your mother also implicates our father. It does, Damien said. Then she knows you won't submit it without implicating Richard. She's been counting on that. That's the actual bind. He kept his voice low. The evidence that takes down Victoria's network is the same evidence that puts your father in a federal courtroom. She's known that for 14 months. She's been waiting for us to hit that wall. Scarlett made a sound. Knock, Chong. Not quite a word. Not quite, not one. Evelyn looked at her sister. Scarlett was standing by the window with her arms crossed and her jaw tight, and her eyes doing the thing they did when she was holding something she hadn't decided whether to say yet. Scarlett, Evelyn said. What? A pause. Dad already knows, Scarlett said, about the exposure. I told him when I gave him the package. She looked at Evelyn and then at the floor and then back up. I told him what was in it. I told him what it would mean for him if it came out. I told him he needed to decide whether he was willing to accept the consequences. Boom. She breathed. He told me he was. He told me he'd spent 20 years making a choice that cost his daughters things he couldn't give back, and he was done making that choice. Her voice dropped. That was 14 months ago, before he met with Mast, before Victoria got to him, Evelyn said. I don't know what she offered him. I don't know what he... Scarlett stopped. He's not a bad man, Ev. He's a weak one. There's a difference. The corridor outside the door, Mast's voice, low and rapid, speaking into his phone, Calder's hand on the doorframe, the pine trees moving outside and the gray sky above them going grayer as the afternoon wore toward evening. Damien took a step toward Evelyn, not the full 8 feet, half of it. He stopped at 4. If we submit what I have, he said quietly, Victoria goes down. Her network collapses. The people she's been protecting for 20 years face exposure. Your father faces exposure. A pause. And it's over. All of it. Permanently. She looked at him. Or we take the deal, he said. And it's never over. She manages it forever, and everyone inside it stays managed forever. He held her gaze. There's no version where we protect your father and take her down at the same time. There's no version where nobody pays. She knew he was right. She had known since the cage. She had known since Scarlett said he opened it. She had known somewhere beneath the knowing since she'd read that letter in her studio in Maine with rain on the windows and Damien sitting across from her for the first time in 3 years. The cost of the true version of this story was her father. She looked at Scarlett. Scarlett looked back at her with the expression of someone who had already made their decision 14 months ago and had been waiting for their sister to arrive at the same place. Calder said from the doorway, his voice stripped to its essential information. Mass just ended his call. 3 men came in through the ground floor entrance 30 seconds ago. We need to make a decision in the next 60 seconds, Calder said. Decide. Evelyn looked at Damien. Damien looked at Evelyn. 3 years of distance collapsed in the space between one breath and the next, and what remained was not romance and not history, but something older and more functional than either. The specific recognition of 2 people who had been aimed at the same thing from the beginning without knowing it. Submit it, Evelyn said. Damien already had his phone out. He dialed a number she didn't know, and when it picked up on the second ring, he said 4 words. Execute the Alderman protocol now. He ended the call. He looked at Calder. How long do we need? 10 minutes to the car. After that, it doesn't matter where we are. Then we have 10 minutes. Calder pulled the door fully open and looked both ways down the corridor. The three men Mast had called in were somewhere below them. They hadn't come up yet, which meant Mast had told them to hold, which meant Mast was still calculating, which meant they had a window that was narrowing by the second. Damien crossed the room to Scarlett and looked at her for a moment. A look that had a full history in it, 14 months of shared work and shared risk, and the particular trust that developed between people who had chosen to be vulnerable to each other in the dark. And then he said simply, "Can you move?" "I've been sitting in a chair for 11 days, Scarlett said. "I can absolutely move." They went into the corridor, Calder in front, moving fast but controlled, his eyes reading every doorway and corner as they passed. Evelyn behind him with Scarlett's arm through hers. Not because Scarlett needed the physical support, but because letting go of her at this moment was not something Evelyn's body was willing to do. Damien behind them, his phone back in his hand, watching the screen. The elevator was at the end of the corridor. Calder bypassed it without breaking stride and pushed through the door beside it, into the stairwell. Concrete. Fluorescent light. Their footsteps coming back at them off the walls. Second floor to ground. 12 steps, one landing. Calder stopped at the ground floor door and held up a hand. They stopped. He listened. Voices on the other side. 2, maybe 3. Moving, getting closer. He looked back at them and his eyes went to the door below the ground floor, the basement access, and he made a small gesture. They went down one more flight into the below-grade maintenance corridor that ran the length of the building and smelled of heating oil and concrete and the particular staleness of spaces that were functional rather than inhabited. They moved through it fast, low light from utility bulbs strung at intervals, Scarlett's breathing audible beside her, Damien's footsteps just behind. The corridor ended at a steel door with a push bar. Calder hit it without slowing, and they came out into the cold afternoon on the building's north side, a service area with a dumpster and a parked utility vehicle, and a chain-link fence at the far end with a gate that was padlocked. Calder looked at the padlock for approximately 1 second, then took the utility vehicle's side mirror in both hands and used the mounting bracket against the gate hasp in a way that required more understanding of mechanical force than Evelyn had, and the hasp gave with a sound like a gunshot in the quiet afternoon air. They went through the gate. The tree line was 30 meters of open ground away. They ran it. They were in the trees when Evelyn's phone buzzed. She pulled it out while still moving, branches pulling at her coat, the ground uneven under her feet, a text from a number she didn't recognize. 4 words and a timestamp. Transmission confirmed. 4:47 p.m. She grabbed Damien's arm and held the phone up. He read it. Something moved through his face. Not relief exactly. Something more complicated and less comfortable than relief. The expression of a person who has detonated something and is now standing in the quiet that comes just before the debris lands. "It's done," he said. They stopped moving. The 4 of them stood in the trees north of the facility in the late October afternoon with their breath coming visible in the cold air and the pine branches moving around them and the sound of nothing. No pursuit, no voices, nothing from the building behind them. And for a moment nobody said anything because there was nothing to say that the moment wasn't already saying. Scarlett put her hands on her knees and bent forward and breathed. Calder stood with his eyes on the tree line behind them, still reading the space, still working. Evelyn looked up through the branches at the gray sky and felt something she didn't have an immediate word for move through her chest. Not triumph, not grief, something that had elements of both and was ultimately neither. The feeling of a thing completed. The particular exhaustion of having carried something to its conclusion. She thought about a ship's log on a conservation table in a studio in Maine, the fibers of it pulling apart. She thought about the brush the diameter of a single hair. She thought, you apply the consolidant, you coax the fibers back. You don't force them, you wait. What followed was not clean, and it was not fast, and it was not the version of events that would later be summarized in court documents and investigative reports, which collapsed months of procedural complexity into paragraphs of passive voice bureaucratic language that conveyed none of the actual texture of it. The actual texture of it was this. Damien's attorney, the one Victoria didn't know about, a woman named Patricia Suarez, who had spent 15 years as a federal prosecutor before leaving to practice privately and who had been holding the complete evidence package in a climate-controlled safe in her office in Philadelphia for 14 months, transmitted the full record to the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Southern District of New York at 4:47 p.m. on October 17th. The transmission included the original ledger, the provenance documented photographs, the 22-year financial flow analysis, the shell company architecture traced to its source, and 47 separately corroborated transaction records linking Victoria Sterling's holding entities to the organized crime figures who appeared in the photographs in Red Hook. It also included Richard Hartwell's financial records. All of them. Evelyn had been the one to tell Patricia Suarez to include them when Damien had looked at her across the gap in the pine trees and asked, one more time, if she was certain. She had been certain. She had not been without grief about it. Those were not the same condition. Victoria Sterling was taken into federal custody 6 days later at her apartment on Fifth Avenue by agents who arrived at 7 in the morning while she was having breakfast. By all accounts, she was composed. She did not make a scene. She said nothing to the agents that wasn't procedurally required. She called her attorney before she allowed them to proceed further, which was both her right and entirely in character. Gerald Mast was arrested the same morning at his office in Midtown. He cooperated extensively with federal investigators beginning on the second day of his custody, which surprised no one who had spent any time understanding his relationship to Victoria Sterling as one of professional utility rather than personal loyalty. His cooperation accelerated the collapse of the network considerably. The man in the facility corridor who had held his weapon and made the correct decision, his name, it turned out, was Marcus Webb, and he had been working for Mast for 6 years, made his own decision to cooperate before he was formally charged, and the information he provided about the facility's operational history, including the names of the medical staff who had participated in Scarlett's detention, added 7 additional counts to an indictment that was already substantial. Daniel Cho, who had been Damien's personal assistant for 9 years, resigned before he could be terminated, and before the federal investigators reached him, which delayed things by approximately 48 hours. He was interviewed 4 times over the following 2 weeks. He did not face criminal charges because his role had been limited to physical access to the penthouse and the placement of audio equipment. Criminal in itself, technically, but the prosecutors had larger concerns and limited bandwidth. He did not contact Damien, and Damien did not attempt to contact him, and the silence between them had the quality of a door that had been sealed rather than simply closed. Richard Hartwell surrendered voluntarily on November 2nd. His attorney had negotiated the terms in advance. He entered a plea that acknowledged his role in the financial arrangement with Victoria Sterling, accepted a suspended sentence conditional on full cooperation, and forfeited all financial benefits received over the 22-year period, which left him with the house in Connecticut, a pension from his early career, and the particular stripped-down dignity of a man who had finally stopped negotiating with himself. Evelyn drove to Connecticut in December, alone. She had been specific about that with Scarlett, who had offered to come, and with Damien, who had not offered but had made clear that he would if she asked. She did not ask. The house was smaller than she remembered, which was not because it had changed, but because she had. She pulled into the driveway and sat in her truck for a moment looking at it. The bare trees in the yard, the front porch light on despite the early afternoon, the smoke from the chimney that meant her father had been home and cold, and had built a fire without knowing she was coming. She had not called ahead. She got out of the truck and went to the door and knocked, which she had not done since she was a teenager, and when her father opened it, the expression on his face moved through several things in rapid sequence. Surprise, relief, guilt, the braced-for quality of a man who had been expecting this conversation for months and had not known when it would arrive. He looked older. He had always been a man who carried his age well, but he looked older now in a way that was less about time and more about weight. "Evelyn," he said. "Dad," she said, "can I come in?" He stepped back from the door. The house smelled the same, wood smoke and the particular faint must of old books, and the coffee he kept running all day in the machine she'd given him for Christmas 11 years ago, which apparently still worked. She stood in the living room and looked at the fire and then at her father, and she thought about 22 years and 2 girls, and the doors that had opened, and all the things she'd been given that had been paid for by a debt she hadn't known existed. "Sit down," she said. He sat down. She sat across from him. I'm not here to forgive you, she said. That's not what this is. He nodded. His hands were on his knees, and he was looking at her with the eyes of a man who had decided to accept whatever arrived. I'm here because Scarlett asked me to come, she said, because she said you told her 14 months ago that you wanted to stop, that you were done making the choice that cost us things. She paused. I need to know if that was still true when Victoria came to you in October. When you met with Mast. He was quiet for a moment. She offered to keep your name out of the submission, he said. She said she could arrange it so everything came out except my role. She said Scarlett would come home safe and my record would stay clean. And you believed her? No. His voice was very low. I knew it wasn't true. I've known who she is for 22 years. I know what her assurances are worth. He looked at his hands. I took the meeting because I was afraid, because the idea of a federal courtroom and my name in the papers and what it would mean for... He stopped. For what you would think of me. You were afraid of what I would think of you, Evelyn said, so you considered protecting yourself at my sister's expense. He didn't defend it. She sat with the fact that he didn't defend it, with the fact that the absence of a defense was its own kind of honesty, and that honesty at this late stage was not the same as virtue, but was not entirely without value either. I didn't take the deal, he said. I told Mast I needed time. I stalled. I called Damien that same evening. He looked up at her. I don't know if that counts for anything. It counts for something, she said. I don't know yet what. The fire moved in the grate. A log shifted and sent a brief shower of sparks up the chimney, and the sound it made was the particular domestic sound of fire, doing what fire did, indifferent and consuming and giving warmth as a byproduct. I can't undo it, he said. Any of it. I know. I could tell you I thought the money was clean, that I didn't understand the full scope, that I made choices under pressure that I wouldn't have made otherwise. He paused. All of that is partly true. None of it is sufficient. No, she agreed. What do you need from me? He said. Not demanding, asking. The question of a man who understood that what he needed was irrelevant and that what remained was only what he owed. She thought about it. She sat in the chair in her father's living room with the fire between them and the winter light coming through the window at a low angle, and she actually thought about it rather than answering from the rehearsed version she'd been carrying. I need you to stop managing it, she said finally. I need you to stop calculating what you can trade away and what you can protect, and what version of the story makes you look most acceptable. I need you to just be the thing you actually are, without the architecture around it. She looked at him. Can you do that? He met her eyes. I don't know, he said. It was the most honest answer he'd given her in years. She stayed for 2 hours. They had coffee, and she sat by the fire, and they talked about things that were not the thing. Scarlett's plans, the work she was going back to, the way Maine looked in December, which she described badly because she was not a person who described landscapes and had never pretended to be. They talked around the edges of the large thing and through it occasionally, and neither of them resolved anything permanent, which was not a failure. Permanent resolution was not what this visit was for. When she left, she stood at the door for a moment and looked at her father, who looked back at her from the hallway with his hands at his sides and his face doing nothing performative, and she thought, this is what it looks like to start from nothing. This is what the beginning of a long and uncertain process looks like. It did not look like hope, exactly. It looked like the absence of the old pretenses, which was the necessary precondition for whatever came next. She drove back to the city. Damien was in the process of dismantling things. That was the right word for it. Not rebuilding yet, not restructuring in the sanitized language of corporate communications, but actively dismantling. The Sterling portfolio had 23 entities. 7 of them were operationally legitimate and financially sound without external support structures. The other 16 ranged from legally compromised to entirely constructed around the invisible architecture Victoria had built over 4 decades. He was unwinding them one by one, with Patricia Suarez and a team of forensic accountants, and the particular thoroughness of someone who understood that halfway was not a stopping point, but a trap. He had moved out of the penthouse. He was living in a rental on the west side, a third-floor apartment with ordinary ceilings and street-level noise and furniture that he had chosen himself from a showroom in Chelsea, which was a thing he had apparently never done before in his adult life. He told Evelyn this on the phone in November with a quality in his voice that was either embarrassment or something adjacent to freedom. She didn't ask which. They talked on the phone regularly. Not every day. Enough. The conversations had the quality of people feeling their way back toward each other in the dark of their own shared history, neither rushing nor retreating, moving at the pace that honesty required rather than the pace that desire or longing tried to impose. She went back to Maine in January. The studio was as she'd left it, the ship's log still in its enclosure, Parchment suspicious and vocal about the extended absence, which she accepted as fair. She worked through the winter with the particular quality of focus that returned after a prolonged disruption, sharper than before, more deliberate, less taken for granted. She thought about things while she worked. She thought about the brush and the consolidant and the patience required, and she understood that these were not just professional principles. Scarlett called every week, sometimes twice. The calls were long and sideways and covered things that were not what they were actually about until suddenly they were. In the way that conversations between sisters who had nearly lost each other sometimes went. Scarlett had started writing again. Not investigative journalism. Something different. Something she was characterizing as long-form personal narrative, which Evelyn suspected was the closest she would get to telling people what she'd learned in that room in Red Hook without testifying. She sounded like herself. She sounded like herself with more of something added that Evelyn didn't have a name for yet. Ballast, maybe. The kind you acquired by being tested at depth. In March, Damien came to Maine. He drove up on a Friday, which he had called ahead to tell her, and she was in the studio when he arrived, and this time she looked up from her work when the bell above the door rang. She set her brush down. She turned around. He was standing in the doorway with his coat dark from the sea mist and his face carrying something different from October. The exhaustion was still there, but it was a different kind. The exhaustion of sustained effort rather than sustained concealment. He looked, she thought, like someone who had been doing the actual work of being a person. It showed. He didn't say her name. She looked at him. "I finished the alderman filings," he said. "The last 3 entities. It's done. Everything that was compromised is either dissolved or in receivership. What's left is clean." He paused. "I wanted to tell you in person." "You drove 6 hours to tell me about filings," she said. "No," he said. "I drove 6 hours because I wanted to see you. The filings were the excuse." She looked at him for a long moment. "Sit down," she said. "I'll make coffee." He sat at the stool by the work table, the same one he'd sat on in October, and she made coffee on the small maker she kept on the counter and brought him a cup and sat across from him, and for a while they were quiet with the good quality of quiet between people who had earned it. Outside the studio windows, the Atlantic moved the way it did in March, restless and gray and cold, the surface of it broken and reforming, the same water it had always been in a shape that was always changing. She had looked at it every day for 3 years, and she still found it useful. The not resolving of it. The continuous motion without destination. "Victoria's trial starts in June," Damien said. "I know. You'll have to testify. I know that too." "Are you?" "Yes," she said. "I'm all right." He looked at her, not the assessing look, not the careful look, just the direct one, the one she'd always trusted most because it asked nothing and concealed nothing. "I know you are," he said. "I wasn't asking that." She looked back at him. "I was asking," he said, "if you would let me be there. When you testify. In the room. If you would let me sit in the room." She felt that arrive with the fullness it deserved. She thought about 3 years in a studio and a ship's log and a cat named Parchment and the particular piece she had built from nothing and what it had cost and what it was worth. She thought about a recording played in a dark room and a name that was never spoken and the years that had moved through her like water through deteriorating paper before she'd had a brush fine enough and steady enough to begin the repair. She thought, this is not where the story ended. This is where the repair was completed enough to hold. "Yes, ici." "Us," she said. "You can be in the room." He exhaled. Something small and very old went out of his face when he did. They finished their coffee. He looked at the work on her table, the ship's log, still in progress, the fibers stabilized now, the page holding itself together where it had been pulling apart. He looked at it with the attention of someone who understood finally what the work actually was. "How much longer?" he said. "Weeks," she said. "You can't rush consolidation." He nodded slowly. "No," he said. "You can't." Meh. Victoria Sterling was convicted on 19 counts in September. The sentencing came in November. 12 years. Federal? No early release provision. She was 72 years old, and the math was what it was, and everyone in the room understood it, including Victoria, who stood for sentencing with the same architectural posture she had maintained throughout her life and said nothing that wasn't procedurally required. Evelyn was there. Damien sat beside her. She watched Victoria's face when the sentence was read. Looking for something, she wasn't certain what. Remorse, perhaps. Recognition. The specific expression of a person confronting consequence. What she found instead was something else. The face of a woman who had decided at some point between the arrest and this room that what she felt about things was no longer available for public consumption, and had sealed that door with a thoroughness that was itself a kind of final performance. Victoria Sterling walked out of the courtroom between federal marshals with her eyes forward and her hands still and her face blank. And the story she had been telling for 40 years ended not with revelation, but with silence. Richard Hartwell sat 3 rows back with Scarlett beside him. He had aged another year in the months since Connecticut. When the verdict was read, Evelyn turned and looked at him, and he was looking at his hands on his knees, and she watched him make a small movement, a settling, a lowering, as if he had been holding himself at a particular height for a long time, and had only now allowed himself to come down from it. Scarlett put her hand over his. He didn't look up. Evelyn turned back to face the front of the room. She breathed. Bum. The following spring was warm. The Hudson River Walk ran for miles along the west side of the island, and in late April the trees along it came into white blossom, the petals dropping and accumulating on the pavement in layers that shifted underfoot like paper. Evelyn and Damien were married on a Saturday in the 3rd week of April, in the late afternoon with the river moving beside them, and the blossoms in the trees, and approximately 30 people who had earned their presence there through the specific test of remaining in the full knowledge of who these 2 people were. There was no ceremony beyond what was required, no speeches. There was music, a string quartet that played with the particular quality of live music outdoors, slightly imperfect, affected by the temperature and the wind and the ambient noise of the city, which was to say it was alive in the way that everything they had learned to value was alive, imperfect and real and refusing to be preserved in static form. Scarlett stood beside Evelyn. She was wearing the wrong shoes for the pavement, and her hair was doing what Scarlett's hair always did when she hadn't entirely managed it. And she had cried twice before the ceremony started, and once during it, and was working on a 4th time and making no particular effort to prevent it, which was entirely characteristic. Richard Hartwell sat in the front row. He had asked Evelyn if he should come, and she had said yes, and he had come and he was there, and that was what it was. Not repaired, not forgiven in any complete or final sense, but present, attempting. In the slow and uncertain way of a man who had lost the protection of his own architecture and was learning, at 70 years old, to stand in the open. Calder was there. He stood at the back and drank 2 glasses of wine and talked to Patricia Suarez for an hour, which was either professional or personal, and he left before dinner and shook Damien's hand on his way out with the particular grip of someone communicating through physical contact what they wouldn't say directly, which was sufficient. When it was done, when the required words had been said and the papers signed and the music finished and the light off the river going golden toward evening, Evelyn stood at the railing above the water and felt the moment the way you felt moments when you were present in them rather than managing them. The cold of the railing under her hands, the smell of the river and the blossom and the particular complex smell of New York in spring. The sound of the people behind her, their voices, their laughter, the accumulated noise of people who had survived something and were now in the presence of something new. Damien came and stood beside her. They looked at the river. "You're thinking about the studio," he said. "I'm thinking about the ship's log," she said. He waited. "The last section was the hardest," she said. The fibers had separated completely in one section, and there was no way to know, going in, whether the paper could hold itself together at all once the consolidant dried, whether it would have enough structural integrity to exist as a single piece rather than fragments. She watched the water. I worked on it for 11 days, very small movements, very consistent pressure, and then I had to leave it. Just leave it completely and let the consolidant do what it was going to do, because there was nothing more I could do to influence the outcome. She paused. How did it hold? He said. Completely, she said. Better than I expected. He was quiet for a moment. I'm glad you know how to wait, he said. I had good material, she said. That matters more than the technique. He reached out and took her hand where it rested on the railing. His hand was warm over hers. The river moved below them the way rivers moved, carrying everything away towards something she couldn't see from here, which was not a problem, which was in fact the nature of rivers and of things that were alive and moving and refused to stay fixed in any single form. She left her hand where it was. The light off the water went gold and then amber, and then the particular deep blue of a city evening coming on. And behind them, the people they had chosen went on talking and laughing in the April air, and the blossoms kept falling in the wind, and the river kept moving, and the story that had begun with a whispered name in the dark of a storm came to rest. Finally, in this, two people standing at the edge of a river in the spring light, holding on, watching what came next.